Merrill drew his pistol and shot and wounded Elisha Tweed. Elisha's father then shot Merrill with a double-barreled shotgun and killed him. There is so much hidden or unnoticed history in surprising places waiting to be discovered and explored. I'm Terry Price, and I have always enjoyed traveling and exploring little-known or forgotten history that's captured on highway historical markers. If that describes you too, I invite you to join me. Let's explore together. Shelton Laurel, a remote area in Madison County, North Carolina, has a rich cultural heritage of traditional Southern Appalachian mountain music. The county is also known for a tragedy that occurred during the Civil War. If you have the chance, take a drive from Marshall to the Shelton Laurel community. Along the way, you'll experience areas that are pristine, remote, and rugged. You'll get a good idea of what the area was like in the middle of the 19th century. At the Laurel River crossing, turn onto North Carolina Route 208 and continue on to the Shelton Laurel community. There, you'll see a historical marker with the following text: Shelton Laurel Massacre. 13 men and boys suspected of Unionism were killed by Confederate soldiers in early 1863. But before we discuss the details of that event, let's take a broader look at the region and the time. North Carolina, a slaveholding state, joined the Confederacy in 1861, but not everyone supported secession. From the outset, many North Carolinians, particularly those in the coastal and mountain regions, rejected the Confederacy and remained loyal to the United States. Approximately 10,000 white and 5,000 black North Carolinians joined the Union Army. A marker in Marshall describes this war within a war. On May 13, 1861, voters gathered in Marshall to elect a delegate for the secession convention to be held in Raleigh. Citizens were divided in their loyalties. Sheriff Ransom P. Merrill and others were later described as hussawing for Jeff Davis and the Confederacy, while men of different opinions were shouting for Washington and the Union. When a dispute broke out between Unionists and the sheriff, Merrill drew his pistol and shot and wounded Elisha Tweed. Elisha's father and former clerk of the Superior Court then shot Merrill with a double-barreled shotgun and killed him. Even after North Carolina joined the Confederacy, residents of Madison County remained divided about whom to support. There was intermittent fighting between people loyal to the United States, called Unionists, and those supporting the Confederacy. There were also Confederate Army deserters who were hiding in the mountains for safety. As the war dragged on, the food staples that the Confederate government had promised, especially salt that was used to cure meat and preserve foods, failed to materialize. In desperation, in early January 1863, approximately 60 Unionists, most of whom were from Shelton Laurel, mounted a raid on Confederate storehouses and private residences in Marshall, taking salt and other provisions. During the raid, they broke into Colonel Lawrence Allen's house. Allen, who was away, was commander of the 64th North Carolina Infantry. The raiders terrorized Allen's wife and 2 children, who were sick with scarlet fever, and stole food and supplies. The raid outraged Marshall residents. In response, a detachment of Confederate soldiers from the 64th, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Keith, was deployed to Shelton Laurel. Their aim was to find the Unionists and quash further raids. Keith, a Marshall native, also believed he could use the effort to avenge the wrongs done to his neighbors. The detachment entered the Shelton Laurel Valley and began a rampage against the residents. Locals were tortured, women were severely beaten with hickory canes until they bled, and ropes were tied around their necks. The people who were tortured apparently never gave the soldiers any worthwhile information. Frustrated, on January 19th, Keith's detachment took 15 males ranging in age from 13 to 60 into custody. They were then marched away. During the march, 2 men escaped. Keith initially was to escort the captives to Knoxville, Tennessee for trial. They were not arrested and tried. Instead, at the edge of an open field, the remaining 13 were ordered to kneel on the ground in small groups. They were then summarily executed in what became defined as the Shelton Laurel Massacre. Among the boys killed were a 13, a 14, and a 15-year-old. The youngest was reportedly executed last. Credible evidence suggests that of the 15 who were captured, only 5 were actually involved in the Marshall Raid. After executing them, the Confederate soldiers threw their bodies into a shallow grave and barely covered them, leaving them vulnerable to wild hogs. An aunt of 2 of the victims, Granny Judy, along with her children, loaded the dead onto a sled and moved them to a nearby cemetery. Keith's and his regiment's brutality made national news. After the war ended, Union forces captured Keith, charged him with 13 counts of murder, and imprisoned him for 2 years in Asheville, North Carolina, while awaiting trial. Keith was acquitted on the first count, so he appealed the remaining counts, arguing that North Carolina's 1866 amnesty law voided any further prosecution. Fearing Judge Lynch, a euphemism for hanging by a mob, he escaped on the night of February 21, 1869. A few days later, the North Carolina Supreme Court ruled in his favor. In 1871, the state dropped its prosecution. He was included in the blanket amnesty granted by President Andrew Johnson and avoided further prosecution and punishment. None of the soldiers who were part of the brutality were arrested or tried for their role. The massacre was North Carolina's worst Civil War atrocity. The approximate site of the massacre is memorialized with a granite marker. A Civil War trails marker is about 6 miles away. There is another Civil War trails marker at the Allen House in Marshall.